to start with, we kind of explain Korth Group and where you guys land in the firearm industry. Like you're not a storefront retailer or things such as that. You're more of a distributor, right?
Correct. Yeah, we're an importer and distributor for a variety of firearms, ammunition, optics, and accessories lines. We've been in business since 1977, and we satisfy a market of independent dealers, box stores, chain stores, military and law enforcement. We have a group of sales guys that span the country, and they are product experts in their field, and they work their areas and work to grow our business in those areas.
Excellent. And you're an Alberta-based company, though, right? You have a presence across the country, as you said, but you're from out this way. I just like to.
Yeah, we're actually down in Okotoks, so quite local. Most of the people here in the office are born and raised Albertans. I'm not, but they gave me a pass, and it's worked out well coming out west.
Well, we accept you, Eastern immigrants, when you behave well enough. So
thank you.
I appreciate it. So, I mean, part of what I want to get into, and I've talked with people from the firearms, I guess you could say lobby almost, or activist groups, people like CSSA, but something that doesn't get talked about enough, I think, especially when we get grabs or issues like this, is that it is an industry. There's a lot of people employed in this. There's a lot of facets to the whole world of firearms. People, if there was any other industry that you targeted and could potentially put so many people out of work and put so many businesses out of business, we'd have a hell of a pushback. But with firearms, they seem to get a pass.
Isn't that the case? And the challenging thing we have here as firearms owners is that we don't really have a hard written gun rights law like our neighbors to the south. So one angle that the industry's taken is an industry organization, which is essentially the business version of the CSSA. The business version is called the Canadian Sporting Arms and Ammunition Association, and their mandate really is to lobby government to protect the industry. We may not have a right to own firearms per se, but we should have a right to earn a living and be able to do that employment in a field that we find interesting and that is perfectly legal and should be not a problem.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, there are, I imagine, I don't have the stats over. There's going to be thousands and thousands of people employed in firearm-related fields everywhere from a retail storefront all the way to, well, often it's volunteer or member-led, but ranges out there and hunting associations. All of these things can fall by the wayside. All of these industries can die if we continue to let this government just keep basically disarming the entire country.
Absolutely. And I can actually provide a few bits of info here for you for numbers. So back in 2019, the CSAAA, which is the industry organization, and the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters commissioned the Conference Board of Canada to conduct an economic impact study of the industry in an attempt to use that info to help sway government to say, hey, there's so many people that make their living doing what they love, let's give them a break. So just some quick numbers for your viewers. So just over 25,000 people responded to the survey. And then the conference board used that data to extrapolate out what the total impact would be for fishing, hunting, sport shooting, and trapping. We'll focus mostly on the hunting and sport shooting today. So 1.3 million Canadians in 2018 hunted, and they spent an estimated total of 5.9 billion hunting in Canada. In the same year, 1.4 million people were sport shooting, and they spent 2.6 billion. So the total impact to our economy that in 2018, and that's just the most recent data we have, was $8.5 billion spent and over 25,000 jobs supported. And as you said, Corey, that's people that work retail, distribution, reps, outfitters, guides, people that are tied to the ranges, anybody that may have a hotel or a restaurant that caters to these events. So it's a fairly sizable amount of people across the country that make their living doing something they love.
Yeah, I was about to say that there's a lot of indirect employment and benefit and things to communities. I worked in the oil field for 20 years, and we'd get a lot of the people trying to. It's an industry that gets quite abused as well, quite often by some ideological governments, and they like to understate how much impact we had in areas when we have crews moving out. But it's not just directly employed people in the oil field. When I'm out there in the field, I'm buying fuel, I'm eating food, I'm staying in restaurants, I'm shopping in the local town that I'm staying in. Likewise, hunters, I mean, they're a very transient group. You could say, since maybe it's the wrong term, but they're on the move. They go into areas for a period of time. It employs people. There's a lot of, particularly in isolated communities. I mean, guiding is very important to a lot of Indigenous communities for people going out hunting. And again, that's under threat if a person can't have a firearm.
Absolutely. And so much of our industry is more rural and suburban based. And, the money that's generated at these independent businesses, and over 90% of our retailers are family run, mom and pop independent businesses. They're in small geographic areas that may not have the same opportunity some of the bigger centers have. And all the money that's generated in the store and wages to the staff is spent back in that local economy. And as you say, with hunting, generally we're not in urban centers when we're harvesting animals. So you're going into the more remote, more backwoods areas in some cases, and some of the small motels and hotels and B&Bs and whatever rely on that travel throughout the hunting seasons to keep their business afloat.
So right now, due to the proposed, anyways, firearms freeze, particularly with the handguns, we already, I imagine you guys have suffered from supply chain issues over the last couple of years, like everybody else. So particularly with that, I'm guessing shipping must have been a bitch. There's been quite a run, though. I mean, now finding a handgun for sale is darn near impossible. It seems they've kind of, on the short term, had the opposite effect of what they wanted to do.
It sure appears that way. An initial expectation from the government, from what we've been told, is that they assume most Canadians would sort of tuck tail and cower and wait for Bill C-21 to be passed. And the initial pitch was that the first reading happened a couple of weeks ago. They had the second reading, I think, last week. And the initial concept is that third reading and royal assent for Bill C-21 would be achieved in the early fall. But Canadians have reacted, in my opinion, the correct way and purchased every handgun they could find. It's been phenomenal. There's never been a run on handguns like this ever in our history from everybody that I've talked to. And so because of that, it appears now as though the feds are trying to push the third reading and royal assent before they break for the summer, which I think is late next week. They wrap up for the year. So
Yeah,
we're
my
really
beloved
hoping
public
we
safety
get
minister said that we got to rush on this, and I would hope that they can stall this. This is a big piece of legislation. This has a lot of potential consequences if they ram that through that fast. Well, I can see the lawsuits already starting. I mean, people who invested and done things because of the basis of this legislation being on the way, and for them to rush it and stop everything in transit, I don't think it's going to end well.
Well, and it'll have zero impact on anything other than disrupting independent business and people spending their after-tax dollars to recreate the way they choose. And that's what everybody in the industry has the biggest issue with, that with this handgun freeze, they're calling it a freeze right now, but we'll see what happens. Most of our dealers, 30 to 90% of their business is geared towards handgun sales. And so it isn't just the firearm, it's the accessories and it's upgrades and repairs. When consumers are walking through a retail store, they are going to end up, impulse buying other things that may not be related to a handgun. And if they're not able to buy any new firearms, we're going to lose that foot traffic coming into our retailers.
Yeah, that's another good point. I mean, it's just like when you go into a grocery store, they stick the dairy and the meat in the far back for a good reason, because they know you're coming in for that, and chances are you're going to grab a little more on the way. You never see the hunting section in a Canadian Tire up by the front doors. They make sure I walk by all that impulse buy crap that usually I do end up leaving. I went in to get a box of 22 shells, and somehow I spent $200 on other stuff while I'm at it. But it's a real important facet. I mean, you kind of chuckle about that, but this is integrated with a lot of businesses. How do they fill that space? How do they keep people employed? What do they do if these areas are suddenly gone?
Oh, exactly. And how do you make up that revenue, and how do you keep your staff employed when you're going to lose what could be your entire business? We have dealers that their entire business model is catering to the sports shooting competitive handgun community. And it's going to be really challenging for them to pivot and try and reestablish themselves as a hunting store or something else entirely when they've built a brand around handguns.
Yeah. So getting a little farther, I mean, regulating stuff to death. It's another area that it's not. This is a sense of how they're going to be doing it anyways. But I remember way back in the 90s, you look like you might be a little young to remember most of that, but with the big battles of the registry back then, something that had happened due to that was, and that registry failed, but every firearm dealer was suddenly going to have to spend, I believe it was like $35 per firearm to register their stock in the stores. Some of them had hundreds and hundreds of firearms. I mean, this was a sudden expense of far more than they were willing or able often to take on. So what they did, I remember walking into one, and that shooting range is gone now, but they actually had a bucket full of 303s that were all laying there. They'd had them for years, and they said $50 each, grab them while you can before the registry gets here. And off they went. I mean, again, it was another run on gun sales. It was a liquidation sale in that case. They were just trying to get rid of them because nobody could afford to hang on to them. But did that make anybody safer? Did it make anything better? Did it improve anything? In fact, the registry got thrown away eventually.
Well, anybody that bought those Enfields sure made out like a bandit with what they've become value-wise now. They're one of the most coveted milsurp guns out there. So hopefully people made well on that deal. But you're absolutely right. There's no positive outcome from any of this. The hard reality is that people are going to lose jobs, and it will have zero impact on anything other than those job losses.
So, just a side note, since we do have a live show, I got commenters asking. Brad Haugen keeps asking. He's looking for 303 shells. Maybe you might know about it. They're apparently really hard to find. Is that a supply chain issue going on, or do you have any idea?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's real delays in everything right now, as we're experiencing everywhere as consumers. Part of the challenge is that the ammunition manufacturers face that there are only so many companies that provide the raw materials, so your brass, copper, lead, powder, primers. There's only so much of that product to be had, and we've seen unprecedented volumes in the last 2 years, partly because of COVID, partly because of various things going on in the US. Canada is subjected to supply chain challenges, as is the rest of the world. And I know the manufacturers are doing their best to try and get the product up here, but we see the panic buying tends to breed more panic buying, that the guy that might buy one box of 303 and use that for a couple of years couldn't find any last year, and now when he does find it, he's going to buy everything he can get his hands on. So it does sort of perpetuate the issue of not enough ammunition being had across the country.
Yeah, it's just getting disrupted all over the place. And again, with panic buying and hoarding, and it doesn't help anybody. Again, doesn't make anybody any safer or anything either. That's the frustrating part, is they always make the case that this is somehow going to make the society safer. So, I mean, you're part of that commercial association. You guys are of the legal arm of firearms sales. Handguns, I mean, heavily regulated, very controlled, very well documented, tracked. You don't deal with your firearms being used in crime, so you don't see that down the road.
No, I mean, the very, very few legal firearms are used to commit crime. The vast majority of the crime guns that are found in Canada are smuggled into the country. And that's a really hard hurdle to overcome. Ultimately, but regardless of what we do as a legal group, there's always going to be that criminal element and always going to be access to illicit firearms. And I think the challenge for the government is, how do you deal with that problem ultimately? I mean, lots of people joke that drugs won the war on drugs because they can't stop them from coming in the country. How are they going to stop the illegal firearms? We legal gun owners are an easy target. Politicians can stand up and rant and rave about how unsafe guns are and how dangerous guns are, and so on and so forth. And they have an active list of where each of us live that own handguns in this country, and what we own, and when we bought it, and how it's supposed to be stored. So it's really easy to come after the law-abiding gun owner simply because they know where we are, and it can appear as though they're doing something to combat gun crime.
Well, that's it. It's the low-hanging fruit. I mean, anybody who is purchased a handgun, I mean, this legislation's been in for decades and decades and decades. You're registered. You have to have a range membership. You can't transport it. You have to take a course, restricted firearms course. All of these things. The people who would go through all of those steps in order to get a handgun, it says two things. For one, they very much enjoy and are dedicated to their handguns for target shooting or whatever else they may like with it. And also, they're rule-following, law-abiding people. They're following the process. They're doing everything right, and then they're getting targeted by the government for having done it.
Yeah, they sure are. And some of these people are competing at the club level. We've national competitions, international competitions. We have a couple of pro staff, brand ambassador type shooters that work with us, that are both on the Canadian IPSC team. And IPSC is an action shooting sport where you're trying to be as accurate and fast as possible to shoot a pre-setup stage. It's a pile of fun. If you've never tried it, I highly recommend trying it. But these two guys are on the Canadian team and are going to Thailand next year to compete for Canada at the world level in IPSC. So this isn't always just a casual plinking on a Sunday afternoon type thing. These guys are shooting 80,000 rounds a year and replacing product and buying backup guns and spending massive amounts of money on their sport and their hobby because they're so passionate about it.
Yeah, so again, as you said, we're just starting right now with a freeze that they're eager to get onto, and I won't necessarily expect you to speculate. I suspect they have no intention of stopping there. That's just step one before they move on to seizure. But is your industry association then getting ready to try and challenge this, like from a association point of view or anything like that?
There's certainly an interest to try. The biggest challenge that we have as an industry is that our voice really is not heard. Uh, we were fortunate with the previous public safety minister; his office was willing to speak with the industry. The current public safety ministers are not quite as free flowing with conversation with us. And quite often, anytime there's a firearms panel to be created, the industry is left out of it. The focus is primarily on victims groups, which, for a mother that's lost her son in a drive-by shooting, it's horrendous. Everybody's heart goes out to her. Anything that they change, though, would not have changed that outcome. So the biggest challenge for us right now is that we would like to see some change, but with the current structure of the government, with the Liberals NDP partnering, they're both very much anti-gun. The Bloc is anti-gun, so really the only group that's standing behind us are the Conservatives, and there just isn't enough of a voice to have an actual say at the moment.
Yeah, well, they play on a lot of emotions. I mean, nobody wants to see, of course, those horrible stories when firearms are misused and people die or are hurt. But I mean, it's just a villainized industry, and it's just been so wrong. And that's a bit of what your association has to try to counter. I mean, the most comparable industry I can think of is like the tobacco industry that got chased around. But the difference is there's no safe or really realistic case made that could be made to consume tobacco. There's no real good reason to smoke or anything else. There's a lot of safe, harmless use of firearms, or even productive use of firearms, whether it's for hunting or target shooting or collecting. All of those things, they aren't going to hurt anybody. So, I mean, I don't think it's fair to compare that industry to tobacco, but it's getting the same abuse as tobacco.
Yeah, it sure is. And the biggest problem we face as an organization, as an industry, and as users is that a lot of Canadians that are not interested in what we do are indifferent or ignorant. And I don't mean ignorant in a negative way; they just don't know. So when they hear these politicians spouting off about making Canada safer and yada yada yada, it makes sense, right? They don't realize that there is a massive increase of women and girls participating in shooting and hunting, and what an inclusive community it is. When you go to these events, there's people from all walks of life and all backgrounds and all classes and different languages, and it's so awesome because they've come here and they weren't allowed to, or maybe minimal access to firearms in their home country, and they've come to Canada and they can participate in something they're passionate about. And that side of the sport is never shown. It's always everything, the messaging in the legacy media focuses so much on crime and a lot of issues that don't even happen in our country. This Bill C-21 miraculously was released 10 days after a bunch of children were killed in Texas. Personally, I think it's in poor taste on the government to have done that. They did the same thing after the mass killing in New Brunswick 2 years ago, and used that as a great springboard to launch their plan to get rid of guns. And they're really not shining the correct lens on our sport at all.
And I'm glad you also brought that up. It was something I hadn't thought of, but you're right. Is this the social cost? I mean, these ranges, these hunting groups, these clubs, these sporting organizations, this is where these are the social center for a lot of people. That's where their circle of friends is. That's where they get together. That's where they have annual banquets. All of these things. Because I was talking earlier about actually some of the costs of the pandemic lockdowns. And again, I don't want to tie that so much into this, but that's a social cost. When you suddenly isolate people and get them stuck in their households rather than getting out and socializing, they can have a hard time. And there's a lot of people whose big social focus is around something firearm related. And if they lose those, that harms people as well.
Absolutely. And so much of what we do is a family and friend based activity, like you said, Corey. But there's a generational aspect of this too. We have dealers that are second, third generation ownership, and dealers that have been in business for over 50 years. And here, as I mentioned, we started in 1977, and Terry and his dad started the company at that time. And now, the next generation is involved in the business. And it's such a great community that really we're not ever displayed, in my opinion, the way we should be to the public.
No, and again, if any community, I think at all, is going to be most opposed to the criminal use of firearms, it's all the people who responsibly use them because they're tired of getting labeled and potentially losing their rights. So
it's very bad for business.
That's another aspect I won't get you to speculating on. But when you criminalize the whole thing in the works, there's going to be a number of people who just decide, well, I'm no longer going to abide, and then now you've created criminals rather than solved anything, and it's just not an improvement whatsoever.
Well, absolutely. And if I could just throw another comment on that, Corey, that one of the big challenges all of us face, whether we're in industry or as users, is the lack of communication. So, a few years ago, the government prohibited Ruger 1022 magazines that had the capacity of more than 10 rounds. And so there were hundreds of thousands of these 25 round banana mags, people would call them, the Butler Creek mags primarily, that were now prohibited, but no communication was ever sent out to the populace to let them know. Industry knew because we could no longer import them. But me as a gun owner that owns a 1022, I never received any communication to say that, hey, this item is now prohibited. And there have been people that have been caught with them, whether they knew or not, I can't speculate. But the communication is really lacking. And even from the industry side, we're not told when changes are going to take effect. When the May 2020 order in council was as of May 1st, and I think they told us on April 30th, the AR-15s are now banned. We have inventory. Dealers have inventory. There's product that's now stuck in a type of purgatory that we can't sell, and we can't easily export back to the US despite the government telling us that we can. That's not how it works. So there's a lot of product that's tied up at all levels of distribution and supply chain that cannot be sold because we were not given any notice to maybe cancel orders or try and clear what we had before the ban took place.
Yeah, I guess. And even on a smaller level, I mean, one of the changes they're looking to bring about with this legislation, I mean, I've got a little rimfire 22 that has a 10 round magazine in it. And if this legislation goes through, suddenly that magazine is going to be illegal for me to have in my possession. Plus, everybody, I guess, who owns a business that sells those or distributes those magazines is now holding onto a criminal item. They're either going to have to destroy it or I guess just take a loss.
Yeah, well, it's yet to be seen, and that change is actually going to come upon us by order of council. So we will be told someday, whenever that's going to be, this week, next week, September, we don't know, that all of a sudden we can no longer import or sell any firearm with more than 5 round magazine. But the feds didn't separate rimfire or firearms that have an internal magazine, like an old lever gun, for example. So the challenge now for us as importers is that the manufacturers are going to need to build Canadian specific product SKUs so that your 22 rifle is now shipped with a 5 round magazine instead of a 10 round magazine. So there's going to be delays and complications with the ordering process, and it's possible it'll drive costs up because now the manufacturers have to build a special makeup SKU for Canada where they could just sell us the regular product before. So the trickle down impact of this is massive, as you say, and all the inventory that's out there, people that have hundreds of magazines or across the country, hundreds of thousands of magazines that are now going to be prohibited, and all that value will be gone, and you might get charged if you get caught with them.
You might even forget the magazines in the back of your cabinet there, and it's sitting there. I mean,
exactly.
It's just ridiculous. Well, all we can do is keep pushing and keep hoping. I appreciate you coming on to talk about though. And like I said, I just wanted to, because you don't hear the conversation enough, lend the industry viewpoint onto this. I mean, there's a lot of people very dependent on this industry, working directly within it, and they don't get a voice at all when these legislations come along. So I appreciate you coming on. Where can we find more information about what your group does or where you're at?
You can check us out at korthgroup.com. We also have pages on Facebook and Instagram. And thank you, Corey, and your team for having us on, because as you say, we don't get a chance to really speak from the business side. And we really appreciate the opportunity to prop Korth Group up a little bit and to speak about what we do. And I sure hope that we see some positivity out of all this at some point.
We like to support good Alberta businesses, and
we appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Adam. We'll talk again soon. Maybe we'll have some good news to talk about.